Здравствуйте, уважаемые зрители! Сегодня у нас по скайпу канадец Мэтью Ehret, человек, которого можно назвать диссидентом к североамериканскому порядку. Давайте пока так скажем, а может быть какие-то уточнения мы узнаем у нашего собеседника. Он автор исторических исследований, автор целого ряда книг. Я вот сейчас зачитаю название. Вот серия называется «Нерассказанная история Канады». Эта серия продолжается книгой, которая в обозримой перспективе выйдет на русском языке. Будет называться «Столкновение двух Америк. Незаконченная симфония». И мы хотели бы послушать мнение человека, который, по сути, антиглобалист, как я уже сказал, диссидент, его взгляд на события в мире, в Северной Америке. Мэтью, здравствуйте. Мой первый вопрос. Вот когда я слышу слово «американская система», у меня такие ассоциации возникают. ФРС, печатный станок доллара, фактически долларовая экспансия, экспансия американских вооруженных сил. Скажем так, это, если кратко говорить, один из главных центров западного мира. А какой смысл вкладываете вы в понятие «западная система» и «американская система»?
In the course of writing my new book, the point that I tried to get across is that the United States itself, as we know it, is not as simple as it seems on the surface. Being a Canadian, I know that I myself have tended to think of America as simply an empire, an evil empire, for most of my life. And it was a really recent event where I began to realize there was something more complex happening. Within one of the chapters, I do develop how the American economy itself was transformed from being a productive industrial economic system in 1971 into becoming what one could consider a time bomb. And the growth of a global US dollar hegemony over the past 50 years under a speculative, deregulated world enterprise, which is sort of at the heart of today's rules-based order, was itself never something intended to be in perpetuity. When you actually look at those who initiated the big transformation, people like Sir Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski, who were both members of the Trilateral Commission, which took over US policy in the 1970s, the idea was always to create a world in transition. Zbigniew wrote a book called Between Two Ages, America Between Two Ages, the Technotronic Era. And in it, he gets at his thesis is that the old era was based upon nationalism, industrial growth, and the new era that has to be brought into being must be based upon effectively world government, decentralized nation states that no longer exist. That period in between would be a period of recolonization in effect, where America would lose the essence of what gave it vitality before that period, when the dollar was floated from the fixed exchange rates onto floating exchange rates. And with that was the creation of a consumer society cult. You had deregulation, mergers of banks, of corporations that became more powerful than national governments. And in the course of that speculative period, the population was induced to increasingly think about worshiping money and thinking very myopically about short-term gains without thinking about the long-term future needs of their society. That bubble, which has today taken over the American economy and much of the transatlantic, is far bigger than the GDP of the world combined. The global derivatives bubble, which is sitting upon unpayable debts, is over $1.2 quadrillion. This is a bomb that will pop, and it was designed to pop, to create a shock therapy in the entire Western population. The idea was to always create that crisis that could then introduce a new system that would not be based on the US dollar per se, but rather on a new type of paradigm based upon depopulation. We saw a sense of this with Henry Kissinger's NSSM, National Security Study Memorandum 200 in 1974, which called for changing the US foreign policy outlook from being one premised around helping nations develop themselves, which is what John F. Kennedy, Eisenhower, Franklin Roosevelt, McKinley, many great leaders all had a view that America was going to assist small countries, poor countries that had been abused under empire, and help them develop full spectrum economies through science and technological progress. That was something that Kissinger in that document, NSSM 200, called for abandoning and saying that now the U.S. foreign policy must be premised around primarily depopulation, population control of countries of the global south, but everywhere, in order to better access and control their resources that were in the U.S. strategic interest. So yes, there are two Americas competing with each other, not just one, and that was the subject and focus of my new book.
Если мы говорим о противостоянии двух Америк, то логично предположить, что у двух Америк были свои лидеры. И вы утверждаете, что 8 американских президентов были убиты. Не 4, а 8. Наверное, можно предположить, что именно эти люди и были лидерами той второй Америки, консервативной, индустриальной, желающей благосостояния для всех. Хотелось бы услышать ваш комментарий на этот счет и, может быть, какие-то доказательства того, что они действительно были убиты.
Most people are not very aware that there were so many presidents, and that was something that, as a paradox, caught me early on. Why did so many presidents die while in office? And the famous ones, the 4 that got shot, are more well known, which start with Lincoln, but then go on shortly after to Garfield, and then McKinley, and then John F. Kennedy. However, there were 4 others who died under other mysterious circumstances. In the case of Harrison in 1840, he was only in for 1 month before he died under a cold. He caught a cold and he died. There was Zachary Taylor 11 years later who also died. He ate cherries and cold milk. Somehow that's the cause of death. We have Warren Harding, an underrated president, but who did incredible things in 1923, who also died of oyster poisoning. And finally, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Of course, added to that, I would also say you have people like Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, who would have become president had he not died in 1968. But when you look at what all of these presidents are doing, because it's not enough to sort of just say that they died, but when you're looking, well, what are they doing? What policies are they activating? What power structures are they challenging? You start seeing that there is a common denominator, a common thread going all the way through American history over many generations. And the policy, the political economic policy being activated is very much similar in all cases, where you have the application of protective tariffs in opposition to the idea of British free trade dumping of goods. The protective tariff is something all nations have a right to use when they want to cultivate their industrial and agricultural internal developments. And every president is doing this. They're also emitting an idea of constitutional national banking, the idea of emitting large-scale credit for big projects through national banking institutions of some form or another. Harrison, the first president to die in 1840 in office, had himself on his desk a legislation that had been passed in Congress and in Senate, waiting for his signature to reactivate the Third National Bank of America. That was killed when he died. So overall, you have an anti-imperial outlook in terms of foreign policy. All of these presidents are trying to make and negotiate agreements with other countries for mutual development. We know John F. Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt had programs with African leaders, South American leaders, to assist them in developing industrial and large-scale infrastructure projects. The same thing for William McKinley, who died in 1901 under an anarchist assassination that was tied to London. He had programs with many South American and Ibero-American leaders to help them develop rail connecting all of the Americas with large-scale development projects associated with it. The idea of the Monroe Doctrine as well, the idea that America was not going to allow itself to be enmeshed into foreign wars under John Quincy Adams' view, which was also adopted by Lincoln, but also would prevent foreign imperial powers from coming into and influencing conspiracies in the Americas, was also very important. Of course, this was abused by certain presidents like Teddy Roosevelt. But the point of this is that they were all challenging the exact same international oligarchical structures of Wall Street, the City of London, who were threatened to lose a lot of their power if these presidents were successful in completing the policies that they put into motion. And in some cases, when they died, their policies continued, and it took a few more years to undermine the momentum of what they were trying to do. The case of Franklin Roosevelt is a good one. Where Stalin told Franklin Delano Roosevelt's son, Elliot Roosevelt, in an interview after his father died in April 12th, 1945, that Churchill's gang killed your father, and they've been trying to poison me as well, in his own entourage in Russia. The idea of Roosevelt was to create a nation, a post-war world after defeating the Wall Street Frankenstein monster called Hitler. The idea was to create a U.S., China, Russia alliance that would be the bedrock of a new global system of cooperation, where the Tennessee Valley Authority that that FDR had created, Franklin Roosevelt, to build America out of the Great Depression, was going to be extended to Africa. People like Kwame Nkrumah, leading figures of the Pan-African movement, studied in America when they brought those ideas back to create a Pan-African movement of anti-imperialism. The same thing was similar for John F. Kennedy, who worked very closely to build hydroelectric dams in Africa, in Ghana, and many other countries to help them break free of colonialism. So this is something which, again, has been consciously obscured and destroyed from history books. And so the point in my hope is that people will see that it's more complex than they might have seen on the surface. And every country has a deep state. The deep state idea is a very new term, but still, that whether it's Russia, whether it's Germany, whether it's Canada, whether it's America, there's not just one country. You have different factions with different ideologies vying for influence. And in the case of the United States, there has never been just one. There has always been, from 1776, an imperial faction of oligarchs within and embedded deeply within the United States, some of whom left and created Canada. That's why I'm speaking English and I live in Canada, is because a bunch of United Empire loyalists left in 1776 when they chose not to go with the revolution, and instead they were given British sanctuary to create a monarchy here in the Americas, in Canada, which poisoned much of the next 200 years of history, which again I go through in my book. But some of those traitors chose to stay behind and work covertly, clandestinely, from within America itself, creating City of London affiliated institutions like Wall Street, like the Bank of Manhattan, which was created by Aaron Burr, who killed Hamilton. And to the list of presidents who died, I would also add Alexander Hamilton in 1804, who was shot and killed by Aaron Burr, the founder of Wall Street. And Alexander Hamilton, and I have several chapters in my book, was one of the prodigies of Benjamin Franklin, who established a system of political economy founded upon what was called the American system by people like Frederick List, the great political scientist who was very well studied in Russia, as well as in Germany, as well as in Japan under the Meiji Restoration. But he studied in America, and he studied the American system, gave it that name. It was a German protectionist, right? And so that was by studying Alexander Hamilton. And so it's a continuity. And the point in my research has been to try to get across that history is not discrete events on a timeline. It's not a bunch of dates and objects on a timeline. It's rather there's a continuous function that unites all of the seeming different events over time, separating generations. And it's this continuous function is shaped by sets of ideas about the future, conspiracies, if you will, for good and for bad. Because we're often taught that conspiracies are always bad. That's not true. There are sometimes conspiracies that are good. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Один из ваших тезисов заключается в том, что лидеры вот этой второй Америки, о которой мы говорим, в некоторых исторических обстоятельствах находили союзников в России. Могли бы вы сказать, кто были эти люди в России и в каких обстоятельствах исторических такое сближение происходило, если действительно оно происходило?
Many Westerners have been brainwashed to believe that Russia and the United States are natural enemies, which is largely a relic of the Cold War brainwashing. In my book, I try to destroy as best as I can that mythology. And rather, when you look at real history as it happened, not as the history books are popularly published and provide narratives, but look at how it happened. There was a natural brotherhood of the United States and Russia going back to the earliest days of young America. The first chapter of my new book deals with Benjamin Franklin, who was a diplomatic, scientific genius who organized international networks all over the world, which made the American Revolution of these tiny 13 colonies possible. Because people often, they don't think about this enough. How did 13 tiny little colonies with no industry manage to beat the world's biggest empire, the British Empire? How did that happen? It didn't happen by themselves.
France helped.
France helped immensely. Benjamin Franklin spent years working to recruit Marquis de Lafayette and thousands of French, as well as the king, to the cause. But also you had figures who recognized the importance of what this movement meant in Prussia. Wilhelm von Steuben was a general who trained American soldiers. You had Kosciuszko of Poland, who came and assisted and helped that revolutionary process. Irish volunteers. Hyder Ali, the Muslim Indian leader of the Mysore, southern India, led a rebellion for many years, starting in 1780, against the British Empire, which absorbed 20% of the British Navy to try to fight the Indians who were fighting for independence. And Hyder Ali, along with his son Tipu Sultan, who led the fight after he died, wrote letters to the Continental Congress saying, "Our fight is one fight. We are in this for a new vision for the future together." So there was a common idea. The vital most important, I think, part of the equation was Catherine the Great and Ekaterina Dashkova. Benjamin Franklin became friends with young Ekaterina Dashkova, who had helped Catherine the Great become the Empress of Russia. And she was an incredible young girl who was a brilliant genius who led the Russian Academy of Science and made Benjamin Franklin the first American member of the Russian Academy of Science. And Benjamin Franklin, in turn, made her a member of his philosophical society. The negotiation allowed for the League of Armed Neutrality to be created, and that league that was led by Russia ensured that supply lines would be maintained over the Atlantic Ocean to help and assist weapons, money, and other needs for the American revolutionaries against the British Empire. Any type of British ship that would try to infringe upon shipments of goods by members of the League would be declared an act of war. So that was a vital component to tipping the balance in favor of the colonists who were fighting for a new type of idea of government founded upon the idea of all men are created equal, made in the image of a creator. That concept was brand new. It was not based upon hereditary law or that your rights are there because a monarchy or a hereditary elite gave them to you and could take them away. It's a very different idea. That continued throughout the 19th century. You had people like George Washington Whistler, who, along with people like Cassius Clay, the American ambassador, but Washington Whistler was an American rail engineer who was invited by the networks made by John Quincy Adams, who was himself earlier the ambassador to Russia from America. He was invited to build Russia's first rail from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and that was done with the help and assistance of various specialists from the United States. And they again recognized that it was never just about economics or money or anything. It was always about empowering a nation to stand on its own 2 feet, so that it could break away from the global control of the British Empire, which controlled international maritime shipping. As soon as nations built rail, they became liberated from reliance upon the monopolies of the British fleets, the British East India Company, which controlled everybody by keeping everybody underdeveloped, stuck to shipping. Throughout the Civil War, that's the second case study in my book, the Civil War was another point that America could have been destroyed under British intrigue. And it was only through the intervention by Alexander II and a network of very, very important people in Russia who came to power after the Crimean War, when Russia realized the nature of British and French intrigues that really destroyed so much of Russia. It was a trap, the Crimean War. And people around Alexander II, like General Mikhail Muraviev, or Edward de Stockel, the ambassador to the United States, or Foreign Minister Gorchakov, they all recognized the strategic importance of saving the United States from being broken up into 2 warring factions, warring confederacies, which was always the design of the British Empire. This is why the Confederate South received munitions, supplies, intelligence from the British the entire time the Civil War was happening. At several moments, the British and the French empires nearly jumped in militarily to officially back the Confederate South, and it was only when in 1863 Alexander II deployed the Russian Navy to the Pacific and Atlantic coasts And Alexander the Second later on gives an interview to a banker, Wharton Barker, where he describes that his reason for sending the Russian naval fleet was as a direct message to the European imperialists, saying that if you were to go in and back the Confederate South, that will be a casus belli, an act of war against Russia, which is the only thing that stopped the French soldiers in Mexico or the British soldiers, 50,000 strong in Canada, who were waiting to jump and help destroy Lincoln. Meanwhile, Canada, British Canada, was always being used by the Confederate Secret Service to run asymmetrical warfare during the Civil War against Lincoln from the north, things like the Albany raids, financial speculation against the greenback, against the US dollar, to help cripple the USA, to help them be destroyed. This was all being done by British sponsorship. So again, the role of Russia was definitive in helping the US survive, and coming out of that process, the sale of Alaska was negotiated as part of a larger design by William Seward, by Ambassador Stockel, to continue Lincoln's transcontinental railway through the Arctic, through British Columbia, into Alaska, and into Russia, where the Trans-Siberian Railway was being constructed by Philadelphia-produced rail cars from Baltimore locomotives. There were people like Mendeleev, the great scientist, came and studied in Philadelphia during the Centennial Exhibition of 1876, along with many other Russian scientists and economists, and they studied what was this American system of protectionism. Mendeleev became the head of the Committee on the Protective Tariff for Russia when he returned, and he worked very closely with his collaborators to apply it, and also the idea of emitting national credit for big industrial projects to help Russia fulfill its emancipation of the serfs, which was begun under Alexander II, who unfortunately died under an assassin's bomb the same year that President Garfield, was also assassinated in the United States. Alexander III tried continuing this very, very heroically in many ways, but he also, his time also was cut short. Probably, there's been various studies that have looked at the possibility of poisoning, and McKinley died soon thereafter. And everything went to hell. And in my book, there was a third point when you had the last real chance of cooperation, and I mentioned this earlier, where Franklin Roosevelt and his allies wished to create an international New Deal, which involved breaking the control of private central banks and putting them under the control of sovereign nation states, and emitting credit for the development of large-scale projects for everybody in the world. And people like Henry Wallace, Franklin Roosevelt's vice president, had a very close alliance with Molotov, Foreign Minister Molotov. And together there's documentation of dialogues they had describing the connection of roads and rail through the Bering Strait, which was supposed to be the driving force of progress after World War II, was to connect the Eurasian landmass with the Americas through the Bering Strait, which was sabotaged earlier, but was a plan that had been many decades already being discussed. Even Nicholas II had commissioned American engineers to go to Russia and to do surveying on the Bering Strait to see how viable building a rail connection would be. And that was 1906, before a certain color revolution got in the way. But you have this common view of a certain idea of brotherhood, of self-interest, of cooperation, which has always been there, and you always had this other foreign oligarchical agency intervening to create coups, assassinations, other forms of terrorism to destroy this natural harmony from blossoming. And that goes again all the way back, like I said, to 1776.
Мы продолжаем нашу беседу, и сейчас мой вопрос будет связан с историей Канады, как она связана с историей России и с темой, которую мы до этого обсуждали. Ну что же, Мэтью, у меня к вам вопрос, который я сформулирую таким образом. Роль Канады во всех этих событиях, естественно, кратко, в том числе, если такая роль была, в вопросе продажи Аляски.
Being a Canadian, this was actually something very close to my heart, and I did want to make sense of why Canada was the only monarchy in all of the Americas. Everyone else, every other American nation is a republic. Why did Canada stay as a monarchy? What is this? So that was a driving force in my curiosity. The story of our founding as a nation was 1867. That was also 2 years after that's when we received the British North America Act. the American Civil War was ended in 1865. This is connected. It's not a coincidence that these two things happened at the same time. When you begin to look at the forces active in the Canadian establishment during the Civil War, there were some very big players like Isaac Buchanan, who was an admirer of Lincoln, who worked to keep Canada neutral, to not back the Confederate South, and who wished to create what's called a Zollverein, a customs union of U.S.-Canada relations, where there would be a protective tariff around the continent, and internally it would be driven not by NAFTA, not by free trade in the NAFTA sense. It would rather be driven by national economic development of big projects together. He was an industrialist. Now, he was ousted in 1864 by people who became the founding fathers of Canada. Their first conference to create the Confederacy of Canada was 1864, during the Civil War itself. I make the point that Britain did not have one Confederate operation against Lincoln, against the North. He had two. He had the Southern Confederacy and a Northern Confederacy. One failed, one was successful. The Northern Confederacy was successful. The momentum at the time was a race to create a system of relations around economic progress. As I mentioned earlier, Alaska, the sale was initiated and finalized in 1867 for $7 million. Canada is very different then than it is today. You had British Columbia as an independent colony separated by about 2,500 miles of Hudson Bay private land. And then you had small 4 colonies of Upper Lower Canada, Halifax, Nova Scotia, and that was it. So the momentum for British Columbia to join the United States was very high. There was a big annexation movement because they were choking economically. They had no connection to the mother country, to Britain. And there was a big movement, huge, to join Lincoln's USA. It was not like the current USA. Lincoln's Transcontinental Railway was begun in 1863. It was finished by 1869 with 2 rails that were planned. They were always planned to go up the West Coast and pass through Alaska. That would then be a driver with a telegraph line into Russia, that would then connect into China, into Asia, that would then move all across Eurasia. That was the dialogues that were happening, the discussions, the momentum was in that orientation. So Canada was largely created. There was a big fight to keep it under the control of British imperial intrigue and to keep it as a wedge dividing U.S.-Russian cooperation. And so in one of my chapters, I document that part of keeping British Columbia, the province, from joining the USA was to pay off its debts, to promise to build a rail line from Montreal to the Pacific, and then to purchase the Hudson Bay land. So the private land that was Hudson Bay property was then purchased for pennies on the dollar by the federal government, signed off by the British Empire. And that's what gave us the borders that we currently know of as modern Canada. Now, my point in my books and all of my writings is that was designed to always be an intelligence operation to destroy the friendship and brotherhood and cooperation between Eurasia, the Old World, and the New World. And as I mentioned in one of my chapters, Lincoln's assassination was orchestrated through Montreal, Canada. John Wilkes Booth himself was here for 6 weeks receiving instructions from Confederate controllers before he was deployed to go back down to the United States to carry out the assassination of Lincoln. And on his person in his hotel room, a $500 banknote was found signed directly by Henry Starnes, who was the governor of the Bank of Ontario, based in Montreal, ironically, and who later in 1865 became the mayor of Montreal as a reward for good deeds. Again, Montreal was always the primary Confederate secret intelligence headquarters, run by people like Colonel Saunders, who was part of the Giuseppe Mazzini networks of Europe, which was also what Albert Pike, the Confederate general, who was a very close ally with Mazzini, running a young America. Mazzini was running anarchist movements all over Europe, right, to keep nations destabilized throughout the 1830s and 1840s, along with Lord Palmerston, the head of British intelligence, and the prime minister at a point. But Mazzini, Palmerston, Albert Pike was a part of that process inside of the United States in the South. You had groups in the North, and Saunders, who was based in Canada, in Montreal, that was his network directly. He was understood as an anarchist. So again, it merges very much into the following assassinations of these various terrorist cells, always orchestrated by British intelligence, whether be it in Russia, that eliminated Tsar Alexander II, whether it unleashed Emma Goldman's networks that killed McKinley. That was, again, part of the Neo-Malthusian operation of its day. It's all the same process, and it's very similar to the type of imperial operations, asymmetrical warfare, that are still active under a modified form in today's world.
Последним вопросом в этом интервью будет вопрос о том, как видит наш уважаемый собеседник происходящее в последние годы в мировой политике. Мэтью, вот вам слово.
Well, I think that looking at history from this standpoint is so valuable for our present circumstances, because history is not about things that happened in the past. It's about battles of competing sets of ideas about the future, right? History is all about people working together around ideas of the future they want to bring into being. Now, those ideas are not necessarily compatible, as we see between the British imperial way of thinking about the world order versus the American, the better American version that arose in 1776. The two paradigms, I think, are largely reflected in today's world that is very much shaped by a tension between two competing futures. We know that we are at the current end of a system. We see the turbulence. We see it's going to get a lot worse in terms of the meltdown of the financial order of the Western transatlantic system. And you have a competition over what type of system will replace it. We know that today we have certain figures operating around such places like the World Economic Forum who wish to utilize this chaos that's been initiated to force through a type of unipolar world order founded upon one center of control where all nation states will be eliminated, and that new system of control will be founded upon certain ideas of value which will be tied to essentially crushing the populations of the world and the means of industrial production of nations, under an idea of a computer model that says the world has an equilibrium that we have to adapt to of finite resources, limits to growth. We see that the other opposing view today is represented by a multipolar alliance around the Great Eurasian Partnership, which instead says, no, sovereign nation states have to be preserved as the basis of international law and economic relations. We have an idea of win-win cooperation, especially coming out of the Belt and Road Initiative led by China, but it has 130 plus nations who have joined on to this international program of long-term development. China is not thinking about closed systems. See, in an imperial world order, a slave society, it's all based upon limits and closed systems, that you have to monopolize whatever resources currently exist, and that also includes resources of the mind. Ideas have to be limited, because you can then get people to fight over diminishing returns of raw materials, food, space. Now, the imperialist will say, because things are always limited, they're a closed system, you can then forecast when overpopulation will become a crisis. Because as Malthus, the leading economist for the British East India Company, the Haileybury College in 1799 wrote in his essays on population that, there's a formula for the geometric growth of human beings and the arithmetic growth of agriculture. And with that
Мальтузианство.
Malthus, yes. And that became a formula that was used to justify things like the Irish potato famine, the famines of India that were designed consciously to check and control populations, to keep them in a sustainable place. So this was always a cover to justify imperialism. It was never a science. It was never justifiable, because human beings, in healthier times past, people understood that human beings were a creature not of our genetics or our material world alone. We were rather a creature of mind, of metaphysics. We could discover ideas and translate those ideas of the universe, which include both gravity, electricity, as well as the moral, just laws of philosophy, and translate those ideas into our willful behavior, such that we could have a periodic table of elements that is always becoming more enriched with isotopes, new discoveries, and new uses of them. So our relationship to the periodic table is constantly changing, whereas with rabbits or monkeys or wolves, it's a relatively fixed relationship to the periodic table. It doesn't change. So human beings our resource is located in the mind, and it transcends the material world. The Malthusian always says no. We are purely material and must obey the material limits, which are monopolized by the elite who control the rules of the game. The rules cannot be broken. Now, creative people don't accept that. Creative people make discoveries and they break rules for the good, lawfully, right? Because you could break rules two ways. You could break rules in an unlawful way, like, for example, kicking over the game board. If you're going to lose chess, you could just break the rules by kicking over the game board, or you could cheat and kill somebody or cause a war. That's an unlawful way of doing it. Or you could do it in a lawful way by making a discovery and then changing all of the relationships in the system. So that's the creative, ideas-based open system view, which America once used to represent when John F. Kennedy called for a Russia-U.S. joint cooperative policy to have a space policy together, U.S. and Russia together doing this. That was his policy. This is the anniversary, actually, just passed, of his announcement at the United Nations in 1963 that this should be our future. His death destroyed that potential. But that is a creative potential. It would have ended the Cold War and created new sets of trust-building mechanisms and new sets of discoveries that would have benefited all humanity. Today, that tradition is being best expressed, ironically. That American system tradition is being most ironically best expressed by the Russian-Chinese alliance. China is much more, I think, developed in the sense that it still has sovereign control of its banking system and has been able to emit long-term credit through national banks that were never privatized for large-scale development. Russia, thank God, has created an alliance where the Eurasian Economic Union has increasingly found itself working together more and more closely, especially things like the Polar Silk Road has become a new manifestation of the Belt and Road Initiative, bringing shipping across the Arctic as well as rail and roads and other development potentials into the Arctic of Russia. These are very synergistic. So I think that this is an ironic lesson for Westerners to realize that when they think that Russia or China are their enemies, it's actually the case when you look at history that Russia and China, especially China, are behaving much more in alignment with the proper American system traditions than America is, which has largely fallen. There is still some fight that I see on state levels against this depopulation agenda, which is being represented by the Great Reset crowd. But by and large, on a federal level, I don't see very much resistance within the United States at this point. I did see it with Trump. There was, as much as people might have problems with Trump as an idiot or something, he did showcase genuine resistance to elements of the depopulation agenda. Which is also why I think that people became more aware that there is a complex fight within two Americas fighting each other because Trump was tapping into something most people did not understand about American nationalism. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has disrupted that massively. But that's a lesson that people need to really take to heart. So that's how I would answer that question.
Мне кажется символичным то, что вы, Мэтью, при всей симпатии к России, тем не менее не упомянули имя создателя периодической системы. То есть вы сказали периодическая система, но не сказали, что это система Менделеева. Возможно, это и есть результат пропаганды тех сил, которые вы считаете относящиеся к Первой Америке, которые хотели бы изъять из истории хотя бы упоминание вклада Менделеева. То есть отменить его открытие они не могут, но путем пропаганды изымают это. Что вы скажете на это?
I think extracting Mendeleev's name, and I did that myself subconsciously. It's funny how that works. But extracting his name, it keeps people from reading Mendeleev's writings, because I had the privilege of reading his Principles of Chemistry, and when you read it, it's revolutionary, it's accessible, it's beautiful. He has strong moral, metaphysical insight that he's connecting to his science. It's all part of the same, and it changes you. And it also shows that his discovery didn't have, like when I was in school, I don't know how it is in Russia, But when I was in school, I was taught that it is the atomic numbers that cause the elements to change. And it's like, well, the atomic numbers, and I mean, and that's what we're told. It's the electrons, right? The electrons that orbits.
Yes.
Now, Mendeleev did not know about electrons. So how did he discover it, and how did he forecast where these missing elements were going to be found in the future, like polonium? He was looking at the qualities in nature, how they crystallize, how they combine with others when put in environments. So he was thinking in a much more top-down, dynamic, holistic way. Mm-hmm. And today, that method of thinking is destroyed in school, because when young people learn to think that way, they can apply it to political systems, to history, to everything, which makes them more, I guess, they won't want to be a slave. I was moved by Mendeleev's insights into the elements was tied to his understanding that Russia needed to develop its mining and its industrial capabilities.
Ну что ж, у нас в студии по скайпу был Мэтью Эрет. Его книга в обозримой перспективе будет переведена на русский. Я снова зачитаю название. «Столкновение двух Америк. Незаконченная симфония». Мы продолжим беседы с Эретом и в следующих передачах поднимем целый ряд тем, которые, надеюсь, будут вам интересны. До свидания, Мэтью. Спасибо вам большое.
Thank you for having me on.